The stepmother smiles and forces the blind little girl to clean the floor she herself dirtied. "My knees are hurting, Mommy." The girl whispers. Minutes later, the millionaire father arrives early, and what he does when he sees the scene is so unthinkable that no one imagines. The mansion, at the crest of the highest hill in the exclusive neighborhood, was a giant of marble and silence. Outside, the morning sun pulled blinding glints from its immaculate facade, a fortress of wealth built to be admired from a distance. Inside, however, the air was cold, still, and sounds died before they could find a wall to echo off. For 5-year-old Lena, the world had no colors, but it had textures, temperatures, and echoes, and that house, a monument to her father's fortune, echoed a void that chilled her small bones. She knew every inch of the cold floor, the velvety softness of the Persian rugs, and the stiffness of the leather sofas where she never felt entirely at ease. The scent of rare orchids, replaced every 2 days by a private florist, mingled with the smell of beeswax and loneliness. And then there were the footsteps. Firm, rhythmic footsteps she had learned to distinguish by the weight of their impatience. They were Veronica's footsteps. That morning, Veronica was bored. Boredom was a constant enemy, a fog that settled in on days when her husband, Richard, was on the other side of the world, turning their already vast capital into even more digits on a portfolio screen. She paced the living room, a space as large and impersonal as the lobby of a luxury hotel. Her eyes scanned the impeccable decor, the priceless art objects, and stopped on a crystal goblet, thin as a promise, filled with dark blackberry juice. A minimal, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. With a deliberate, almost lazy motion, she let it slip from her fingers. The sound of the crystal shattering was sharp, a dissonant note in the house's silent symphony. The dark liquid spread across the white marble like an open wound. "Lena, darling, come help Mommy." Veronica's voice was honey, pouring down the hallway. Hearing the word Mommy, Lena's little heart gave a leap. It was a word Veronica used rarely, like a treat offered to a trained animal. The girl came quickly, her bare feet making almost no sound. Her small hands were outstretched, her fingers brushing the air to feel her way. She stopped a few feet from the stain. The sweet, acidic smell of the juice filled her nostrils. "Oh, what a disaster," Veronica said, her tone one of false lament. "Mommy was so clumsy. Will you help me clean it up, my angel? I want to teach you how to take care of our home." Lena smiled, a pure smile, anxious to please. "Yes, I'll help." She knelt, feeling the cold of the floor through the thin fabric of her dress. Her small hands searched for the cloth she imagined Veronica would give her, but no cloth came. "With your hands, sweetheart." Veronica's voice was calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "So you can feel the mess. That way, you'll learn not to make another one." Confusion flickered across Lena's face, but the fear of being a nuisance, of being a burden, was greater than any doubt. She hesitated for a moment, and then, obediently, plunged her fingers into the cold, sticky puddle. The sensation was awful. The chilled liquid seeped under her nails, staining her pale skin. She tried to gather the juice, pushing it with her palms, but the stain only spread. Veronica watched, standing, her expression perfectly neutral, her arms crossed. There was a shadow of satisfaction in her gaze, the satisfaction of one who reaffirms her power over something fragile. The girl continued her useless task, her white dress now stained purple at the knees. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of her hands rubbing the marble. After a long moment, Veronica turned and left the room without another word, leaving Lena alone, on her knees, in the middle of that vast, white and soiled space. And in the silence that followed, Lena understood, for the first time, that the sharpest cold in that house didn't come from the marble floor. The days that followed were marked by an even denser silence. Lena moved through the house like a miniature ghost. Her hands almost always held close to her body, the fear of touching something forbidden becoming a second skin. She learned to map the empty spaces, the safe distance between herself and the crystal vases, between her small feet and the rugs that were not to be stepped on. The humiliation of the blackberry juice had left an invisible stain on her soul, a constant reminder that any mistake, however small, was a grave failure. Veronica, for her part, watched. She saw the girl's shrinking posture, the way she recoiled when her voice was a little too loud, and felt a pang of triumph. It was working. The process of erasing the other woman's traces involved remaking the child in her own image, submissive, silent, and above all, aware of her place. The perfect opportunity for the next step came on a sunny afternoon when boredom once again descended upon Veronica. From the library window, she saw Lena in the garden. It was one of the few places where the girl seemed to relax. With her bare feet on the soft grass, she guided herself by the scent of the flowers, touching the petals of a rosebush with a delicacy that bordered on reverence. It was a moment of pure innocence, a silent dialogue between the child and nature. To Veronica, however, it was a provocation. That garden was her project, an expensive investment meant to impress guests, a visible part of the family's immense assets. Each rose had been hand-picked. Seeing them touched by those small, uncertain hands was to her a violation. She picked up the phone and dialed Richard's international number. He answered on the third ring, his voice tired but sharpened by business. "Veronica, is something wrong? I'm in the middle of a meeting about the investment funds." "No, darling, everything's fine," she replied, her voice laden with false sweetness. "I don't want to interrupt your work. I know how important the returns on those assets are for our future. It's just about Lena." She paused dramatically. "I'm worried. She's in the garden, pulling the petals off my prize-winning roses. I talked to her, Richard, with all the love in the world, but she doesn't seem to understand boundaries. She needs structure, rules. With you so far away, busy growing our fortune, I feel the responsibility is all mine." On the other end of the line, Richard sighed. He pictured profit spreadsheets and dividends, the cash flow of his companies. The last thing he wanted was a domestic problem. "Do whatever you think is best, Veronica. You know what's right. Her education is the most important investment." Those were the magic words. "Thank you, my love. I knew you'd understand." She hung up the phone with a victorious smile and walked toward the garden. Her steps on the grass were firm, determined. Lena sensed her approach and shrank back, her little hand still hovering near a red rose. "Lena," Veronica's voice was soft but sharp. "What have I told you about touching what isn't yours?" "I was just smelling it," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. "You were disobeying," Veronica corrected, taking the girl's hand with a firmness that made her flinch. "Your father and I spoke. We agreed that you need to learn to respect things. Beautiful things are not meant to be ruined." She led her inside, silently, to the playroom. On a shelf sat a small wooden music box, a gift from the mother Lena barely remembered. The girl touched it every night before sleep, its gentle melody her only companion. Veronica picked up the box. "Until you learn to value what you have, you can't have things that bring you joy." With a metallic click, Veronica placed the music box on the highest shelf of a closet and locked it. The key disappeared into her pocket. "This will stay here until you've become an obedient little girl. It's for your own good." She left, closing the door behind her. Lena stood in the middle of the room, her hands empty, her heart tight. The silence that settled was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a punishment, an invisible wall that separated her from the only melody that still connected her to a loving past. The nights became the longest. without the familiar melody of the music box. The silence of Lena's room was a dark and endless ocean. She would curl up under the Egyptian cotton sheets, trying to recreate the song in her mind, but the memory of the sound would fade, replaced by the echo of Veronica's words. Until you learn to value what you have. Value. The word was a puzzle. She valued the warmth of the sun on her face, the soft touch of the grass, the melody that made her feel less alone. But the things in the house, the cold and untouchable objects, she had only learned to fear. Obedience became her only shield. She began to move with redoubled care, hands behind her back, head bowed, a small satellite orbiting Veronica's universe of rules, desperate not to collide with anything. 2 days later, the sound of thin, polite laughter floated from the living room. Veronica had a guest, Eloise, a woman as elegant and empty as her hostess. They spoke of the success of the latest charity auction, where social returns seemed as important as financial ones to their multi-millionaire husbands. They discussed the latest fashion trends from Paris and the difficulty of finding staff who didn't question orders. Lena listened from afar, sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, a place she considered safe. Thirst scratched at her throat. She knew she should ask one of the maids, but the memory of Veronica's voice on the phone with her father paralyzed her. She needs to learn boundaries. Asking for help would be another bother, more proof of her inadequacy. She would be a burden. Seized by a fragile courage, she decided she would do it herself. She slipped silently into the kitchen, a sanctuary of stainless steel and black marble. The silence here was different, humming with the contained energy of expensive appliances. Her fingers found the refrigerator door and she opened it, feeling the cool air on her face. With her other hand, she felt along the countertop until she found a glass. It was heavy, thick crystal, one of those Veronica insisted on using daily because, as she said, wealth should be felt in every detail. Lena filled the glass with water, the sound of the liquid seeming far too loud. With both hands, she clutched the precious object and turned. That's when her bare foot slipped on an invisible drop of water on the polished floor. The sound of the crystal shattering on the marble was like a gunshot in the heart of the house. For a second, Lena felt nothing but the icy shock of water on her legs. Then panic flooded her, an overwhelming wave that left her breathless. I broke it. I broke something expensive. Daddy doesn't like messes. Veronica will be so mad. The fear was so intense, it supplanted every other sensation. Instinctively, she knelt, her trembling hands searching for the shards, a desperate repetition of the juice scene. She had to clean it, hide it, erase the mistake before Veronica arrived. That's when she felt the sharp sting. A pointed shard sliced the tip of her index finger. Blood welled up, hot and thick. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror of what was to come. Blood was another stain, more proof of her failure. Her heart hammering in her chest, she made a decision. Ignoring the pain, she picked up the largest shard, the one stained with her blood, and hid it in the pocket of her dress. With the hem of her dress, she tried to wipe the rest of the blood from the floor, smearing it into a pinkish smudge. Footsteps were approaching. "Lena, what was that noise?" Veronica's voice, coming from the hall, was cold and impatient. Lena shot to her feet, hiding her injured hand behind her back. The shard of glass in her pocket pressed against her leg, a spear tip reminding her of her crime. She stood there, trembling, as Veronica's tall silhouette appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes fixed on the shards scattered across the floor. "What have you done?" Veronica's gaze swept over the scene, lingering on the crystal shards and the pinkish smear spreading across the black marble. Her eyes, cold as 2 chips of ice, finally settled on Lena. There was no anger in her expression, but something much worse. A calm, cutting disappointment, the look one gives a defective object. Lena shrank under its weight, her injured hand throbbing behind her back, the shard of glass in her pocket, feeling as if it weighed a ton. I... I slipped, the girl whispered, her voice choked by the sob she fought to swallow. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix things. Lena, Veronica said, her voice low and controlled. She stepped closer, and the expensive scent of her hand cream seemed to suffocate the air. Do you understand the value of things? Your father works day and night, travels the world, deals with stocks, with the market, to build a net worth for you. For us, he builds this wealth so you can be surrounded by beautiful things. And this is how you show your gratitude. By destroying what he gives us. Every word was a needle, precise and painful. She wasn't angry about a broken glass. She was passing judgment on Lena's character. Lena shook her head, tears finally streaming down her face. I didn't mean to. No one ever does, Veronica sighed, a theatrical sound of exhaustion. Now, clean this up and be careful not to cut yourself. The last thing I need is another problem to solve. Her heart sinking, Lena knelt again. With her good hand, she began gathering the larger shards, placing them carefully in a pile. Her injured hand remained hidden, clenched into a fist. But the blood, stubborn, found a way through, and a single red drop fell onto the dark floor. Veronica noticed immediately. What is that? Did you hurt yourself? Her tone was not one of concern, but of accusation. Before Lena could answer, Veronica grabbed her wrist and forced her hand open. The sight of the cut, small but deep, made her lips tighten into a thin line of annoyance. Wonderful, just wonderful. Look what your carelessness has caused. Another mess. She dragged Lena to the sink, turned on the cold tap, and shoved the girl's finger under the stream, making her wince in pain. Without a word of comfort, she grabbed an antiseptic from the cabinet and applied it with a contained brutality. Lena bit her lip to keep from crying out. Veronica's touch was not that of someone caring for a wound, but of someone impatiently fixing a broken object. After applying a tight bandage, she gave her a light push. Go to your room. Let me deal with your mess. Humiliated, and with her finger throbbing, Lena went upstairs. The silence of the house seemed to accuse her. The days dragged on, each a grey copy of the last. The bandage on Lena's finger was a small white beacon in her world of darkness, a constant reminder of her mistake. She moved with the caution of a frightened animal, hands always behind her back, ears tuned to the slightest sound that might signal Veronica's approach. The house, once merely silent, now seemed to hold its breath, complicit in the constant surveillance she was under. Lena spoke less and less, eating what was given to her without a word, accepting the silence as a penance. She would spend hours sitting on her bedroom floor, her toys untouched, trying to be as quiet as possible. Being quiet, she decided, was the first step to not being a bother. If she made no noise, perhaps she wouldn't break anything. If she touched nothing, perhaps she wouldn't make a mess. One afternoon, as a light rain tapped against the mansion's giant window panes, Lena felt a deep thirst. The kitchen, the scene of her last disaster, was forbidden territory in her mind. But her dry throat urged her on. She left her room, gliding down the hallway like a shadow. As she passed her father's office, a room Veronica had appropriated in his absence, she heard her stepmother's voice. The door was ajar, and the sound escaped, clear and crisp. Veronica was on the phone, her tone different from the one she used with Richard. It was a voice of confidence, tinged with vanity. Yes, Eloise, it's working perfectly, she said with a low laugh. It's a matter of patience and method. Richard gave me free rein. He's so focused on business, on the performance of his assets, that he barely has time to breathe. He called me yesterday from somewhere in Europe, talking about how the cash flow improved after a new tech investment. Euros, dollars. The family's net worth just keeps growing. But what good is all this wealth if the house isn't in order? There was a pause. Lena held her breath, her heart beating erratically. The girl, oh, she's learning. It was a challenge at first, that silent stubbornness. but she's starting to understand that the world doesn't revolve around her. You have to be firm. By the time he gets back from Asia, she'll be used to obeying me. The words hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. She shrank against the cold hallway wall, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob. She didn't understand the malice, the envy, the power play. She only heard the part her 5-year-old brain could process. By the time he gets back, she'll be used to obeying me. The phrase repeated in her mind, spinning and transforming into a terrible, unshakable truth. Obeying wasn't just about not breaking glasses or not touching roses. It was a condition, a test. A chilling fear, far deeper than the fear of Veronica's punishments, took hold of her. It was the fear of losing her father. In her simple logic, the equation was devastating. Her father loved her. Veronica was in charge while he was away. If she wasn't obedient, Veronica would tell him. And if he knew she was a disobedient girl who caused trouble, who broke things and made messes, he would be sad, he would be angry. And worst of all, he might leave her. The thought was so monstrous it left her breathless. He would leave her with Veronica forever, in that cold, silent house. She retreated, step by step, back to her room, the sound of Veronica's laughter echoing in her ears. She sat on her bed, her body rigid, her hands clenched into small fists. From that moment on, a solemn promise formed in her frightened heart. She wouldn't just be quiet. She would be perfect. She would give Veronica no reason, however small, to complain. She would become the most obedient girl in the world. She would be invisible, flawless, a ghost of perfection. Also that when her father finally came home, he would find her worthy of his love. The deadline was set. The countdown had begun. Lena's promise of perfection transformed the household routine. She woke before sunrise, her internal clock set by a precise fear. She dressed herself, her nimble fingers buttoning the impeccable dress, her socks perfectly aligned. At the breakfast table, she sat erect, eating in silence, not spilling a single crumb. She became an expert in anticipation. She could feel, from the vibration of the footsteps upstairs, Veronica's mood. If the steps were quick and hard, Lena would make herself scarce in her room. If they were slow and dragging, she knew her stepmother's boredom would soon find a target, and she worked to be even more invisible. Her only escape, her only confidant, was a small brown teddy bear with one button eye hanging loose and its fur worn in patches. His name was Barnaby, a gift from her father on one of his first trips. At night, under the covers, she would whisper to him, telling him about her day, about how much she missed her dad, about the promise she had made to herself. This new, unnerving perfection, however, began to deeply irritate Veronica. The girl's silent obedience was almost an act of defiance. There were no flaws to correct, no mistakes to punish. Lena had become a smooth, polished surface where Veronica's cruelty could find no purchase. The frustration grew in her like a weed. One morning, while on the phone with Eloise, her impatience overflowed. "I don't know what to do with her, Eloise. She's become a little statue. And Richard, oh, he's on another planet. Yesterday he was telling me about the performance of some tech stock, then about the potential of Bitcoin as if it were the new gold. His net worth in dollars just multiplies. But at what cost? I'm stuck here managing this house and this child." That afternoon, Veronica entered Lena's room without warning. The girl was sitting on the floor, her back to the door, with Barnaby in her hands. She was whispering softly, her head bent toward the bear. "It won't be long now, Barnaby. Daddy's coming home soon, and he'll see how good I am. He'll stay." "Who are you talking to?" Veronica's voice cut through the air. Lena jumped, the little bear falling from her hands. She turned, her face pale. With no one. With Barnaby. Veronica approached, her eyes narrowed. She picked up the bear from the floor, holding it with her fingertips as if it was something dirty. I heard you. You were talking about your father, whispering secrets, weren't you? Plotting things behind my back. She was twisting the scene's innocence, turning it into a conspiracy. No, Lena said, desperation in her voice. I just miss him. Missing him is a distraction, Veronica declared, a decision forming on her face. This old, dirty thing is keeping you from focusing on what's important, your responsibilities, your obedience. As long as you have these childish attachments, you'll never mature. With deliberate calm, she walked to the tall closet, the same one where the music box was locked away, and tossed Barnaby onto the highest shelf, out of Lena's reach. He'll stay there with your other distractions. Maybe now you'll understand that the real world requires focus, not whispering to dolls. Veronica left, leaving Lena standing in the middle of the now completely silent room. The loss of Barnaby was the loss of the last friendly voice, the last touch of comfort. She was finally entirely alone, thousands of miles away in a Tokyo hotel room. Richard ended the video call that sealed the biggest deal of his career. The screen went black, reflecting his tired face. Millions of euros had been added to his empire. He should have been ecstatic, but he felt a cold emptiness in his chest. He picked up his phone and opened a photo of Lena, taken almost a year ago. She was smiling, her face turned toward the sound of his voice. A wave of guilt and a piercing sense of loss hit him with the force of a punch. What was he doing? Amassing a fortune for a daughter he barely saw. The money, the interest, the dividends, none of it mattered in that moment. With an impulsive move, he called his personal assistant. Yumi, cancel the meeting in Shanghai and the one in Singapore. Rebook my flight home, the fastest one possible. I'm going home, now. The absence of Barnaby left a hole in Lena's universe. The bear wasn't just a toy. He was an archive of her secrets. The only listener who didn't judge her. Without him, the loneliness became a physical presence, a weight on her chest. Yet fear was a more powerful motivator than grief. The countdown to her father's return continued in her mind, and each day that passed without incident was a small victory. She became a model of behavior, a shadow moving through the house without a trace. And this perfection was, to Veronica, the most infuriating of affronts. She felt like a hunter facing prey that refused to run. Lena's submission was so complete, it became a form of passive resistance, a mirror that reflected Veronica's cruelty back at herself. The need to break that spirit, to provoke a reaction, a flaw that would justify her contempt, became an obsession. That morning, the house was especially silent. The air was still and heavy, premonitory of a storm. Veronica wandered the living room, boredom corroding her edges. She glanced at her phone, thinking of calling Richard, perhaps to complain about something, perhaps just to hear the sound of his distant voice, a confirmation that her connection to his business empire was still intact. He was a billionaire now, not just a multimillionaire, a distinction that mattered in her circles. His assets were spread across treasury funds, high-tech stocks, and even cryptocurrency, a concept she barely understood but which sounded like power. She was the guardian of that power on the domestic front, and Lena was a defective asset, a smudge on the image of perfection she worked so hard to project. An idea, cold and precise, crystallized in her mind. It would be a repetition, but with a renewed purpose. A final lesson, the harshest of all, to cement her authority before Richard returned and saw the new Lena, the version she had molded. She went to the kitchen and filled a crystal goblet with the same dark blackberry juice. The thick purple liquid looked like royal blood in her hand. She walked with deliberate steps to the center of the grand entrance hall, the heart of the house, where the white marble was most vast and unforgiving. "Lena!" Her voice rang out, no longer honey, but a command coated in false kindness. Lena appeared at the top of the staircase, small, and fragile. She descended the steps slowly, with a heartbreaking caution, her hands clasped firmly behind her back. She stopped at a safe distance, waiting. "Come here, darling. I want to show you something." Lena approached, her body tense. Veronica smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "See how the house is gleaming today. So clean, so perfect. This is how your father likes it. He works so hard to give us all this fortune, and our only job is to keep everything in order." And then, with a movement that seemed both accidental and rehearsed, the goblet slipped from her fingers. The sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed through the silent hall. The juice spread like a dark spiderweb on the immaculate floor. The familiar scent rose into the air, and Lena flinched, a spasm of pure dread running through her body. She looked at the stain, then at Veronica's face, and saw the cold satisfaction in her stepmother's eyes. She understood. This wasn't an accident. It was a test. Lena trembled, tears welling in her eyes, but she swallowed them down. The promise, she had to be perfect. She knelt, the fabric of her clean white dress immediately soaking up the purple liquid. Her small, trembling hands hovered over the sticky puddle. "Clean it," Veronica said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but charged with absolute power. "Clean it properly. Daddy likes the house to be clean." Lena's hands were trembling so badly she could barely feel the cold of the marble. The smell of blackberry was nauseating, the purple stain on her dress like a bruise on her innocence. She focused on the task, on the promise she had made to herself. Clean, be perfect. It was the only thing that mattered, the only way to secure her father's love. Veronica's voice was a distant hum, an oppressive presence pushing her down. Every second she spent with her hands in that mess was another step away from the abyss of abandonment. She didn't notice the subtle shift in the hall's acoustics, the draft of air that announced a door opening. She didn't hear the sound of footsteps on the plush runner in the foyer, footsteps she knew but wasn't expecting to hear. The click of the lock was so discreet that Veronica barely registered it. But then the massive oak door swung open, and Richard's figure filled the frame. He looked weary from the long journey, the lines on his face deeper, but his shoulders were straight, the posture of a man accustomed to command. The shock on Veronica's face was instantaneous, a mask of welcome hastily pulled over a canvas of panic. She stretched her lips into a wide, forced smile. "Richard, my love, what a wonderful surprise. You didn't say you were arriving today." But he wasn't looking at her. His eyes, which minutes before had been analyzing the closing of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, were fixed on the scene in the center of the hall. Time seemed to freeze. He saw the broken crystal, the dark stain on the immaculate white floor, and he saw his daughter, on her knees, her white dress stained, her small, trembling hands plunged into the filth, and he saw his wife, standing over her, watching like a general inspecting a soldier under punishment. All the travel fatigue vanished, replaced by an ice that started in his stomach and spread through his veins. The conversations, Veronica's complaints about Lena's lack of boundaries, his own rushed, negligent replies, "Do whatever you think is best." It all coalesced in his mind, forming a single, horrifying and clear picture. The fortune he was amassing, the assets, the inheritance he was building. It all seemed grotesque and worthless in the face of this silent humiliation. Veronica saw the shift in his expression and tried desperately to regain control. "Darling, it's not what it looks like. I was just teaching Lena about responsibility. She had a little accident with the juice, and I thought it would be a good lesson." Richard held up a hand, a small gesture that silenced her immediately. He ignored her completely, as if she had become part of the house's expensive, lifeless furniture. He took one step forward, and then another, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the rug, but each step seemed to shake the foundations of that castle of appearances. He stopped a few feet from his daughter. His voice, when it finally came, was not loud, but it had the cold, hard clarity of a diamond. "What is going on here?" Lena heard her father's voice and her small body tensed. He was here, early. She wasn't ready. The house wasn't perfect. She had failed. Panic suffocated her. It was all her fault. In a trembling voice, without lifting her head, she answered with the truth that inhabited her terrified heart. "I'm cleaning so you won't be mad." The sentence struck Richard with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't the scene, not Veronica's lie, but that innocent, devastating confession that broke something inside him. He looked at Veronica's shocked face, and the contempt in his gaze was absolute. Then, he did something no one expected. He knelt on the marble floor, next to his daughter, the fabric of his designer trousers soaking up the sticky juice. He was there, on her level, in the middle of the mess. He touched her shoulder with infinite gentleness. "Sweetheart, why would you think I'd be mad?" Richard's question hung in the air, freighted with a weight Lena couldn't comprehend. She felt the gentle touch on her shoulder and flinched. It was a real touch, not the rushed, impatient kind she had grown used to. She slowly raised her head, her unseeing eyes turning toward the voice that was her safe harbor. Fear and confusion warred on her face. Why was he here, on the floor with her? Why wasn't he mad? The logic of her world was unraveling. Because I broke it," she whispered, her voice failing. "And I made a mess. The house has to be clean for you." Each word was a knife in Richard's heart. He looked at his daughter's hands, stained purple, and at the faded bandage on her finger. The rage he felt for Veronica was a controlled burn, but the pain he felt for his own failure was an ocean. He had built a business empire, a net worth that placed him among the world's wealthiest men. But he had failed to protect the one treasure that truly mattered. He raised his eyes and met Veronica's gaze. She was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The facade of the perfect wife shattered like the crystal on the floor. "Leave us," he said, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "Richard, I can explain," she began, her voice desperate. "I said leave us." The command was absolute. Veronica hesitated for a moment, shock and humiliation battling on her face. Then she turned and walked out of the hall, her stiff-backed retreat echoing her defeat. Alone with his daughter, Richard felt the enormity of his neglect. He had left her in this marble mausoleum, believing that money and security were substitutes for presence, for love. With a tenderness he didn't know he possessed, he took Lena's hands and wiped them clean with the silk pocket square from his jacket. "This is just a floor, my love," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just a glass. None of it matters. The only thing that matters is you." He lifted her into his arms. She was so light, so fragile. She burrowed into his chest, her body still shaking, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to sob. The sobs were small and contained at first. Then they came with the force of a bursting dam, releasing weeks of accumulated fear, loneliness, and sorrow. Richard held her tight, rocking her, whispering words of comfort that felt inadequate and late. He carried her upstairs, past the living room where Veronica stood, frozen like a statue. He didn't look at her. In his own bedroom, a sanctuary of neutral tones and understated luxury, he set her down on his bed. The contrast of the small, stain-dressed figure against the high thread-count sheets was jarring. He needed to understand the depth of the damage. "Lena," he said softly, sitting beside her. Did she ever hurt you?" Lena shook her head. It wasn't a lie. Veronica had never laid a hand on her. Her cruelty was of a different nature, more subtle and perhaps more devastating. She just teaches me to be good." Richard closed his eyes. The simplicity of that sentence revealed everything. He looked around the room, a testament to his wealth, the expensive watches, the business books, the phone that connected him to a multi-million-dollar cash flow. And he realized, with painful clarity, that he was living in a world of emotional liabilities, of debts that couldn't be paid with dollars or euros. His greatest failure wasn't trusting Veronica. It was convincing himself that love could wait, that the investment in his daughter could be deferred. He had outsourced affection, and now he was seeing the devastating interest on that decision. He stood up, resolve hardening in his heart. This silence, this order, this fear, it would all end right now. He walked to the intercom and pressed the button for the head housekeeper, Mrs. Almeida, a woman who had been with the family for years, but whose silence he now understood as fear. Mrs. Almeida, his voice was firm. Please ask all staff to come down to the entrance hall immediately. Richard's summons echoed through the mansion, breaking the tension with the authority of a thunderclap. Within minutes, the staff began to assemble in the grand entrance hall. The housekeeper, Mrs. Almeida, her grey hair in a tight bun, the chauffeur in his impeccable uniform, the two maids in their starched aprons, and the gardener, who nervously twisted his hat in his hands. They lined up near the wall, eyes downcast, apprehension visible in every posture. They knew something seismic had occurred. Veronica was there too, near the base of the stairs, trying to reassemble her mask of dignity. But her pallor and the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Richard descended the stairs slowly, holding Lena's hand. The girl, now in a clean dress, clung to him, her small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He stopped in the center of the hall, the same spot where less than an hour before, his daughter had been on her knees. He looked at the faces of his employees, people who lived and worked under his roof, silent witnesses to what had happened here. He saw the fear in their eyes, and guilt struck him again. Their silence had not just been out of loyalty to him, but out of fear of Veronica. He took a deep breath. This would not be a private confrontation. Lena's humiliation had been subtle, but the repair needed to be public, clear, and final. I want to apologize to all of you, Richard began, his voice calm but resonating with unshakable power. I apologize for not being here, for not seeing what was happening in this house. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I believed that providing luxury and security was enough. I was wrong. My daughter's well-being is my only priority. It is the only investment that truly matters. He turned to Veronica. His gaze no longer held the cold anger from before, but a frigid distance. The assessment of a CEO cutting a toxic asset from his portfolio. Veronica, he said, and the use of her name, stripped of any term of endearment, was like a sentence. From this moment on, you will never be alone with my daughter again. You will not give her another order. Your responsibilities in this house are terminated. A collective, almost inaudible gasp went through the line of staff. Veronica took a step forward, her face contorted with disbelief and fury. Richard, you can't do this. This is absurd. You're humiliating me in front of the staff over a childish tantrum. It wasn't a tantrum, he replied, his voice still controlled. It was what I saw with my own eyes. I saw my daughter on her knees, cleaning a mess you made on purpose because she was afraid of making me mad. This castle of vanity you've built has crumbled today. He turned to Mrs. Almeida. Mrs. Almeida, from now on, you will report only to me. You and your staff will ensure that Lena has everything she needs, and above all, you will ensure she is never left alone with Mrs. Richard. The fall was devastating. For a woman who lived on appearances, who measured her worth by the power she wielded over others, being publicly stripped of her authority in front of those she considered beneath her was the ultimate blow. Her castle had cracked, and everyone was there to witness it. She looked at the faces of the staff and, for the first time, saw not fear, but a flicker of relief, perhaps even pity. She was exposed, stripped of her power. It's over, Veronica, Richard said, with a finality that left no room for argument. Later that night, After a tense silence had settled over the house, Richard went to give Lena her bath. In the quiet of the bathroom, away from the drama of the hall, he expected to see relief on his daughter's face. But she was quiet, huddled in the warm bath water. His victory didn't seem to have reached her. He was carefully washing her hair when she spoke, her voice small, almost inaudible against the sound of the water. "Daddy, were you sad at me?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He stopped, his hand hovering in the air. He had confronted Veronica, dismantled her tyranny, reaffirmed his place as protector. But the wound, he realized in that instant, was so much deeper. Veronica's cruelty was only the symptom. The disease was his abandonment, his silence, the fear that he had unintentionally planted in her heart. She still saw herself as the cause of the problem. He had rescued her from the humiliation, but guilt still held her captive. In that moment, he understood that just leaving this house wouldn't be enough. He had to pull her out from the shadow of that abandonment, an abandonment that had started long before Veronica ever arrived. The revelation in the bathroom changed everything for Richard. It wasn't enough to remove the threat. He had to heal the wound. The next morning, as the mansion still slept under a heavy, strange silence, he made a decision. There would be no more meetings, no calls about the stock market, no analysis of his fund's performance. He picked up the phone and, with a few curt sentences, put his empire on hold. Then he went to Lena's room. She was sitting on the bed, hugging her knees, a small island of loneliness. "Good morning, my love," he said, his voice gentle. "How about we take a trip, just the two of us?" Lena lifted her head. "A trip? Where to?" "To a place that speaks more quietly," he answered, using a phrase he knew she would understand. He didn't pack a single bag. He just took his daughter's hand, walked down the stairs, and without a backward glance, stepped out the front door. In the car, as they drove away from the marble fortress, Lena was silent for a long time. Then she asked, "Are we coming back?" "We're never going back to that silence again," Richard promised. He drove for hours, leaving the big city behind, the landscape transforming into something simpler, greener. Their destination was an old wooden house nestled between sand dunes and the constant sound of the sea. It was the family's beach house, a place he hadn't visited in years. It was where he had lived with Helena, his first wife, Lena's mother, before the avalanche of money and success had swept them into the city and, eventually, apart. The house was simple, almost rustic. The wooden walls absorbed sound instead of reflecting it, and the air smelled of salt and sea spray, not imported flowers and wax. As soon as they arrived, Lena seemed to transform. She kicked off her shoes and walked barefoot on the cool sand, her hands outstretched, her face turned toward the ocean breeze. A genuine smile, the first Richard had seen in a long time, lit up her face. "This house does speak more quietly, Daddy," she said, confirming his promise. In the days that followed, they created a new routine made of simple things. They built sandcastles, which Lena felt with her hands. They hunted for seashells, which she identified by texture, and they sat on the porch, listening to the rhythm of the waves. Richard learned to describe the world to her not with colors, but with sensations. The sun wasn't yellow, it was warm. The sea wasn't blue, it was the sound of a giant breathing. He was relearning how to be a father, stripped of his billionaire's armor, vulnerable and present. One rainy afternoon, while looking for blankets in an old wooden chest in the attic, his hand brushed against a dusty metal box. He opened it, and the contents made him catch his breath. Inside were letters, dozens of them, in Helena's elegant handwriting, and underneath the letters, small cassette tapes he had completely forgotten. They were things he had packed away after their separation, pushing them to the bottom of the chest and his memory because the pain had been too great. He found an old tape player and put in the first cassette. Helena's voice filled the small room, young and full of a melancholy sweetness. It was an audio diary recorded during her pregnancy with Lena and in the first few months of her life. "My little love," the voice on the tape said, "you smiled for the first time today. The doctors say you can't see me, but I know you feel me. I sing you to sleep and feel your tiny heart calm down. I'm so scared, little one. Not of you, but of me. There's a sadness inside me, a fog that won't lift. Richard doesn't understand. He thinks he can fix everything with gifts, with a bigger house. But the sadness doesn't want a bigger house. It wants a place to rest. I love you so much it hurts, and that's why I have to make sure you'll be okay, even if I can't be." Richard listened, tape after tape, letter after letter. The story he had told himself for years, that Helena had left him for his success, that she couldn't handle the pressure, crumbled. She hadn't left out of a lack of love. She was sick, battling a deep depression that he, in his blind ambition, had been unable to see. He had judged her, had erased her from his daughter's story so he wouldn't have to deal with his own pain and guilt, and he realized, with a clarity that devastated him, that the silence that enabled Veronica's cruelty hadn't started with her arrival. It had started with him, years earlier, when he chose silence over truth. The discovery in the attic shook Richard to his core. He spent the night sleepless, Helena's voice echoing in his mind. The words from her letters seared into his heart, the narrative he had constructed to protect himself, that of a man abandoned by a woman who couldn't handle his success, was revealed as a self-serving lie. He hadn't been abandoned. He had done the abandoning. He had abandoned Helena in her silent struggle, and by extension had abandoned Lena to a vacuum of memory, an incomplete history. The fortune he had amassed, the deals that had made him a billionaire, all of it felt meaningless now, built on a foundation of denial. The greatest return on investment in his life wasn't in his portfolio, but in the chance to fix the past. With a renewed determination, he spent the next morning on the phone, not with stockbrokers or fund managers, but with a private investigator, a discreet and efficient man he had used years before for corporate matters. The task was simple, and yet the most complex of his life: find Helena. While he waited, he devoted himself to Lena with a presence that was entirely new to them both. He taught her to feel the stars by gluing small, raised beads onto a large black board. "This is the Big Dipper," he would say, guiding her fingers. "And this is Orion. They're always there, even when we can't see them." He was, in truth, talking about her mother. 2 days later, the investigator called. Helena had been found. She wasn't far, living in a small coastal town a few hours away. She led a modest life, volunteering at a small daycare for underprivileged children. She had never remarried and had no other children. Guilt and grief, it seemed, had kept her in a self-imposed exile. A lump formed in Richard's throat. The fear of opening that door, of facing the ghosts of his past, was immense, but his love for his daughter was greater. That afternoon, he sat with Lena on the porch, the sound of the ocean serving as a soundtrack. "Lena," he began, his voice slightly trembling, "I need to tell you a story about your mom." He told her everything, about Helena's joy at learning she was pregnant, about the song she sang to her in the womb, and about the sadness, the fog that had enveloped her and made her feel she had to leave to protect her child. He didn't use complicated words, just the plain, unvarnished truth, stripped of judgment. "She loved you more than anything, sweetheart. She just didn't know how to stay." Lena listened in silence, absorbing every word. When he finished, she asked the only question that mattered. "Where is she now?" "She's close," Richard answered, "and I think she would really love to see you." The next day, they drove to the small town. The daycare was a simple house, colorful and filled with the laughter of children. Richard felt his heart pound. He left Lena in the car for a moment and walked to the door. A woman with brown hair, with gentle lines around her eyes, appeared. It was Helena, older, her face marked by life, but with the same sweet eyes he remembered. The shock of recognition hit her like a wave. "Richard, Helena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. We need to talk." He didn't accuse her. He asked for her forgiveness, for his blindness, his ambition, for not fighting for her. Tears streamed down her face as she listened. The guilt that had haunted her for years finally began to recede. "She's here," Richard said at last. "She wants to see you." He went to the car and returned, holding Lena's hand. Helena stood frozen in the doorway, her body caught between longing and fear. Lena stopped a few feet from her, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Helena's voice came out as a whisper, as fragile as a dry leaf. "Hello, my love." Lena turned her head toward the sound. She couldn't see her mother's face, but she heard the melody in that voice. A melody her soul somehow recognized. She took a step forward, letting go of her father's hand. Are you my real mommy?" Lena asked, her voice full of an almost unbearable hope. Helena knelt, bringing herself to her daughter's height, her tears now flowing freely. "I always have been, my angel," she answered, her voice breaking. "I just haven't been here." And then Lena smiled and ran into the arms that had been waiting for 5 long years. The embrace between mother and daughter was a moment of pure catharsis, the silent healing of wounds both had carried unknowingly. Richard watched, his heart overflowing, feeling at once like an intruder and the bridge to this reunion. In the days and weeks that followed, they built a new dynamic as delicate as the first buds of spring. Helena began visiting them at the beach house, first for a few hours, then for a full day. There was no rush, no pressure. The reunion unfolded at Lena's pace. She rediscovered her mother through the sound of her voice, the touch of her hands, the soft lavender scent that always accompanied her. As the bond between Helena and Lena blossomed, Richard tied up the loose ends of his old world. He returned to the mansion one last time, alone. The house was cold and silent, but the silence felt different now, merely empty, no longer oppressive. Veronica was there, waiting. She tried to argue, to appeal to their years of marriage, to their public image, to the assets they had built together, but Richard was unmovable. "This isn't about our assets, Veronica. It never was," he said, with a calmness that disarmed her. "This is about what was done to my daughter. I could have sought public revenge, exposed every detail, but that would only bring Lena more pain. So we'll do this cleanly and quickly." He offered her a generous divorce settlement, a figure that would ensure she maintained her luxurious lifestyle. There was, however, one non-negotiable clause. She would sign a legal agreement to never again approach or attempt to contact Lena in any way. Any violation would result in the loss of everything. He wasn't seeking revenge, but justice and, above all, protection. Veronica, seeing the end of her power, the loss of her image, and the collapse of her control, signed. She disappeared from their lives as quietly as her cruelty had once crept in. Richard sold the mansion, ridding himself of the monument to his own negligence. He transferred a significant portion of his fortune into a trust fund in Lena's name, securing her future in a way that meant the money would serve her, not the other way around. He also made a substantial anonymous donation to the small daycare where Helena worked, ensuring the place could expand and help even more children. His focus shifted completely. He drastically reduced his business travel, delegating responsibilities and learning to manage his empire from a distance. He discovered that true wealth wasn't in accumulating more capital, but in the freedom his existing capital could provide. The freedom to be present. He and Lena moved to the beach house permanently. He had it renovated to be more comfortable, while keeping its simplicity and warmth. Helena became a constant, loving presence. She and Richard did not resume a romantic relationship. The wound between them was too deep for that. But they found a new kind of partnership, a friendship built on forgiveness and a shared purpose. Lena's happiness. They became a family, not in the traditional mold, but in a configuration that worked for them, woven from the threads of healing and unconditional love. Lena flourished in this environment of love and security. The quiet, frightened girl who moved like a shadow gave way to a curious and joyful child. Her laughter echoed through the wooden house, mingling with the sound of the waves. The fear of being a bother was replaced by the confidence to explore. She learned to read Braille, devouring stories with her fingertips. The music box and Barnaby the bear were rescued from the mansion and now held places of honor in her new room, symbols of a past overcome. One afternoon, as the three of them walked along the beach, Lena stopped and turned her face to the sky, as if she could feel the colors of the sunset. "You know, Daddy," she said, with the serenity that had always characterized her, but which was now tinged with joy. "I used to think I had to be perfect for you to love me. Now I know. I don't have to be perfect. I just have to be Lena." Richard and Helena looked at each other over her head, and a deep understanding passed between them. The journey had been painful, but the resolution, the peace they had found, was real and lasting. The conflicts had been resolved, not with shouting and revenge, but with truth, forgiveness, and the patient rebuilding of love. The years that followed at the beach house were woven with the golden thread of normalcy and affection. The rhythm of life was set by the tides, not the financial markets. Richard discovered a new kind of success, measured not in dividends or stock appreciation, but in his daughter's smiles and the peace of his own conscience. He continued to manage his businesses, but in a way that served him, not the other way around. He learned that the greatest inheritance he could leave Lena was not a portfolio of investments, but the certainty that she was unconditionally loved. He and Helena became the best of friends, dedicated co-parents, finding in Lena's happiness the redemption for their own past pains. Lena grew into an intelligent and compassionate young woman. The absence of sight had sharpened her other senses in extraordinary ways. She perceived the world with a depth most people would never know. She could feel a person's shift in mood by the cadence of their breathing, read intentions in vocal inflections, and find beauty in the texture of a leaf or the warmth of a sunbeam. Her journey, marked by the overcoming of silent suffering, had forged in her an immense empathy. On a summer morning, her 18th birthday, Lena woke with an idea. She spent the day working in her room with intense concentration. In the late afternoon, she called Richard and Helena into the living room. In the center of the room, on a table, was a large canvas covered by a sheet. "I have a gift for you," she said, her voice full of a quiet excitement, "for giving me the world." She pulled away the sheet. On the canvas was a stunning work of art. It was a constellation, but not one that existed in the sky. It was a relief painting, made with different textures: coarse sand, crushed shells, woolen yarn, small glass beads. Each material represented a moment in her life. There was the harsh grit of the marble from the old mansion, the softness of Barnaby's fur, the grainy texture of the beach sand, the sharp points of the stars her father had taught her to see. In the center, three smooth, warm shapes made of polished wood, intertwined. It was them. "I wanted to feel the sky with my hands," she explained, her fingers gliding gently over her creation. "This is my sky. Every part of it is a piece of our story. The rough parts remind us where we came from, but the soft, warm parts show us where we are now." Richard and Helena stood speechless, tears shining in their eyes. The painting was a testament to their daughter's incredible strength and resilience. She had taken the darkness of her world and transformed it into a universe of textures and sensations, a map of her journey from pain to healing. The imaginary camera, which had once focused on a small, trembling hand cleaning a cold floor, now slowly pulled back. It showed the scene in the beach house, the father, the mother and the daughter, united before this unique work of art. The brush was in Lena's hands now, and she painted not for anyone's eyes, but for everyone's soul. The constellations she created, the ones she would never see, were proof that the most important vision doesn't come from the eyes. The light of the setting sun streamed through the window, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. The sound of the waves broke gently on the shore, an eternal lullaby. The journey had been long and filled with shadows, but they had found the light, not in a vast fortune or a perfect facade, but in the simple, profound truth the blind girl had taught them from the very beginning. Love isn't what you see, it's what remains.